The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the small holding cell as former Army Sergeant Michael Torres sat on the cold metal bench, staring at the floor beneath his worn boots. Just 18 months ago, he had been standing on a parade ground receiving the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States for extraordinary heroism in Afghanistan. Now he was facing charges of armed robbery and assault. Waiting for his court appearance in what seemed like the final chapter of a dramatic fall from grace, Michael's hands shook slightly as he remembered that terrible night 3 weeks earlier, when desperation had driven him to make the worst decision of his life. His daughter Emma needed surgery that their insurance wouldn't cover. Medical bills were piling up faster than his disability payments could handle. His wife Sarah had been working double shifts at the hospital, but it still wasn't enough. When he saw the convenience store clerk counting money late at night, something inside him snapped, and he made a choice that would haunt him forever. The transformation from war hero to criminal defendant seemed impossible to everyone who knew Michael's story. 3 years earlier, his squad had been pinned down by enemy fire in a remote Afghan valley when he single-handedly charged an enemy position to save his wounded teammates. Despite taking multiple bullets himself, he had carried 2 injured soldiers to safety before returning for a third man who would have died without immediate help. The action had cost him his left leg below the knee and ended his military career. But it had saved 3 lives and earned him the nation's highest military honor, defense attorney. Jennifer Walsh sat in her office reviewing Michael's case file, struggling to understand how a decorated war hero had ended up facing serious felony charges. She had handled hundreds of criminal cases during her 15-year legal career. But Michael's situation was unlike anything she had encountered. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Security camera footage clearly showed him threatening the store clerk with what appeared to be a weapon and taking money from the register. What troubled Jennifer most was that Michael had never denied the charges. From their first meeting, he had been completely honest about what he had done. Showing genuine remorse and accepting full responsibility for his actions, he seemed more concerned about the shame he had brought to his military service and his family than about the potential prison sentence he was facing. "I don't expect anyone to understand or forgive what I did," Michael had told Jennifer during their initial consultation. "I dishonored everything I once stood for, and I deserve whatever punishment the court decides. I just want to make sure my family doesn't suffer anymore because of my mistakes." Jennifer had tried to explore various defense strategies, including temporary insanity, extreme emotional distress, and the potential impact of his combat-related injuries on his decision-making. However, Michael consistently refused to use his military service or his wounds as excuses for his criminal behavior. His unwavering acceptance of responsibility was both admirable and legally challenging for his defense team. The case had attracted significant media attention due to Michael's status as a Medal of Honor recipient. Newspaper headlines screamed about the fallen hero, and television reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to cover what they saw as a compelling story of military valor followed by civilian disgrace. The attention made the situation even more painful for Michael's family, who found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Judge William Harrison had been assigned to preside over Michael's case, bringing 30 years of judicial experience to what promised to be one of the most challenging and emotionally complex cases of his career. Judge Harrison was known for his fair but firm approach to criminal justice, his respect for military service, and his commitment to understanding the full context of every case that appeared before his court. What the media, the prosecutors, and even Michael's own defense team didn't know was that Judge Harrison had a personal connection to the defendant that would profoundly influence his handling of the case. 25 years earlier, during his own military service as a young Army lieutenant in the First Gulf War, Harrison's life had been saved by a soldier whose bravery and quick thinking had prevented what would have been a catastrophic attack. On their forward operating base, the soldier who had saved Harrison's life, along with dozens of other American personnel, had been Sergeant First Class Roberto Torres, Michael's father. Roberto had spotted enemy infiltrators approaching their position and had single-handedly held them off until reinforcements arrived, sustaining serious wounds in the process. Lieutenant Harrison had visited Roberto in the military hospital, promising that he would never forget the debt he owed to the brave sergeant who had saved his life. Roberto Torres had died 5 years later from complications related to his combat injuries, never knowing that the young lieutenant he had saved would go on to become a federal judge. Harrison had carried the memory of Roberto's sacrifice throughout his civilian career, often wondering about the Torres family and whether Roberto's children had followed their father's example of military service. When Harrison first saw Michael Torres's name on his docket, he immediately recognized the connection. A quick review of military records confirmed that Michael was indeed the son of the man who had saved his life decades earlier. The realization created a complex ethical situation for the judge, who would need to balance his personal gratitude toward the Torres family with his professional responsibility to ensure fair and impartial justice. Judge Harrison had spent several sleepless nights considering whether he should recuse himself from the case due to his personal connection to Michael's family. Legal ethics required judges to avoid cases where they had conflicts of interest. But Harrison also felt that his unique understanding of the Torres family's military sacrifice might provide important context that could serve the interests of justice. The night before the trial was scheduled to begin, Harrison sat in his study at home, looking at an old photograph from his military service that showed him standing with Roberto Torres and other members of their unit. The young sergeant in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Michael, sharing the same determined expression and proud military bearing that had characterized his father. Michael's wife, Sarah, visited him in jail the evening before his trial, bringing pictures that their daughter Emma had drawn during her hospital stay. The 8-year-old girl had been asking when her daddy was coming home, not fully understanding why he couldn't be with her during her medical treatment. Sarah struggled to maintain her composure as she looked at her husband through the reinforced glass of the visiting room. The surgery went well, Sarah told Michael, her voice breaking slightly as she shared the news. Emma's recovering faster than the doctors expected. She keeps asking when you're coming home to read her stories. Michael felt the weight of his actions crushing down on him as he thought about his daughter facing medical procedures without her father's comfort and support. The money he had stolen had been intended to help his family, but his actions had, instead, created even more pain and separation for the people he loved most. Sarah, I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow in court, you and Emma are better off without me, Michael said, his voice heavy with self-loathing. Dad, I've proven that I can't be trusted to make good decisions when things get difficult. Maybe it's better if I just serve my sentence and stay out of your lives. Sarah's response was immediate and fierce. Michael Torres, don't you dare give up on our family. Emma needs her father and I need my husband. What you did was wrong, but it doesn't erase everything good about who you are. We're going to get through this together, just like we got through your deployment and your injuries and everything else. The next morning, Michael entered the courtroom wearing the only suit he owned, his prosthetic leg hidden beneath his pants, but his military bearing still evident in his posture and demeanor. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious spectators, a few fellow veterans who had come to support their former comrade. Despite his current circumstances, Judge Harrison took his place at the bench, his expression carefully neutral. As he surveyed the courtroom, he had made his decision about how to handle his personal connection to the case. But the weight of that choice sat heavily on his shoulders. Everything he was about to do would be scrutinized by appeals courts, legal scholars, and the media who were covering this high-profile case. As the prosecutor began presenting the state's case against Michael Torres, Judge Harrison listened carefully to every detail while struggling with emotions he had kept buried for 25 years. The young man sitting at the defendant's table was the son of the soldier who had saved his life, now facing the possibility of spending years in prison for a crime born of desperation and poor judgment. The irony was not lost on the judge. Roberto Torres had sacrificed his health and ultimately his life serving his country. And now his son, also a decorated combat veteran, was being prosecuted for actions taken while struggling with the aftermath of his own military service and sacrifice. Harrison understood that his handling of this case would need to honor both the demands of justice and the memory of a fallen hero who had given everything for his fellow soldiers. What nobody in that courtroom could have anticipated was that Judge Harrison was about to make a series of decisions that would challenge conventional approaches to criminal justice while honoring the complex legacy of military service and sacrifice that connected 3 generations of the Torres family. The Medal of Honor that Michael had earned through his heroism in Afghanistan was about to play a role that would surprise everyone present and create one of the most emotionally powerful courtroom moments in the court's history. The second day of trial began with an unexpected development that caught everyone in the courtroom off guard. Judge Harrison announced that before proceeding with closing arguments, he wanted to examine a piece of evidence that had been submitted, but not yet presented to the jury. Court clerk Angela Martinez brought forward the evidence box containing Michael's Medal of Honor, the distinguished decoration that represented the pinnacle of military valor. This medal, Judge Harrison said, holding the ornate decoration carefully in his hands, represents extraordinary heroism in combat. Before we conclude this trial, I believe the jury should understand exactly what Master Sergeant Torres did to earn this recognition. District Attorney Chen immediately objected, arguing that Michael's military service was irrelevant to the criminal charges he faced. Your Honor, while we respect the defendant's military background, his past heroism cannot excuse present criminal behavior. The jury should focus on the facts of the robbery, not be distracted by emotional appeals to military service. Jennifer Walsh supported the judge's decision. Sensing an opportunity to provide crucial context about her client's character, Your Honor, the defendant's military record is directly relevant to understanding his character and the circumstances that led to his actions. The jury has a right to consider all aspects of his background when determining appropriate justice. Judge Harrison overruled the prosecution's objection, his decision creating a stir among the reporters and spectators present. Most criminal trials focus narrowly on the specific charges at hand. Judges rarely allowed extensive exploration of defendants' backgrounds unless directly relevant to their defense strategy. Master Sergeant Torres, Judge Harrison said, addressing Michael directly, would you please tell the jury exactly what you did in Afghanistan to earn the Medal of Honor? Michael stood slowly, his prosthetic leg making the movement slightly awkward. He had rarely spoken publicly about his combat experience, preferring to keep those memories private. However, the judge's request left him no choice but to relive one of the most traumatic and heroic moments of his military career. Your Honor, my squad was conducting a patrol in Helmand Province when we were ambushed by a much larger enemy force. Michael began, his voice steady despite the emotional difficulty of the subject. 3 of my soldiers were wounded in the initial attack, and we were pinned down with no way to evacuate them. The courtroom listened in rapt attention as Michael described the firefight that had nearly cost him his life. Delivery made the extraordinary nature of his actions even more impressive. Demonstrating the kind of humble heroism that characterized the best military leaders, I realized that if we stayed in our defensive position, my wounded soldiers would die from blood loss before help could reach us, Michael continued. So I decided to assault the enemy position directly, hoping to create enough confusion to allow my team to evacuate the casualties. Judge Harrison watched the jury's faces as they listened to Michael's testimony, noting how their perception of the defendant was shifting as they learned about his battlefield heroism. Several jury members appeared visibly moved by the description of his selfless actions under fire. What happened when you charged the enemy position? Jennifer Walsh asked, guiding her client through testimony that she hoped would demonstrate his character and commitment to protecting others. Michael's voice became quieter as he described. The most difficult part of his combat experience was hit multiple times during the assault, but I managed to neutralize the immediate threat and create an opening for my team to reach the wounded soldiers. Then I realized that one of my men, Private Johnson, was still trapped and couldn't move, under his own power. The courtroom was completely silent as Michael described returning to the battlefield despite his own serious injuries to carry Private Johnson to safety. His actions had saved the young soldier's life, but had cost Michael his leg and ended his military career. The heroism he described seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the man who had been arrested for robbing a convenience store. Clerk Roberto Sanchez sat in the gallery listening to Michael's testimony with growing confusion. in conflict. Just weeks earlier, he had been terrified by this same man's threatening presence in his store. Now he was hearing about extraordinary acts of courage and self-sacrifice that painted a completely different picture of Michael's character. Judge Harrison had been listening to Michael's testimony while studying the Medal of Honor, remembering his own experience of being saved by Roberto Torres in similar circumstances. The parallels between father and son were striking. Both had risked everything to save fellow soldiers. Both had sustained serious injuries in the process. Both had demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that defined true military heroism. Master Sergeant Torres, Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested deeper significance. After being wounded in combat and losing your leg, how did you transition to civilian life? The question opened up territory that neither attorney had expected to explore during the trial. Michael's struggle with civilian transition was relevant to understanding his current circumstances, but it also threatened to reveal the systemic failures that had contributed to his desperate situation. Michael hesitated before responding, unsure how much detail the judge wanted about his post-military challenges. Your Honor, the transition was very difficult. The physical injuries were manageable with proper medical care, but adjusting to civilian employment and dealing with financial pressures while supporting a family was much harder than I expected. Did you receive adequate support from veteran services during this transition? Judge Harrison asked, his question drawing an objection from the prosecution, who argued that systemic issues with veteran care were beyond the scope of the criminal trial. Judge Harrison sustained the objection, but continued to explore Michael's background in ways that suggested he had deeper insights into the defendant's situation than most judges would possess. The courtroom began to sense that something unusual was happening. Though no one could yet understand the full significance of the judge's intense focus on Michael's military service and family background, Roberto Sanchez found himself reconsidering his own feelings about the robbery as he listened to testimony about Michael's military heroism and family struggles. The man who had threatened him was clearly the same person who had risked his life to save fellow soldiers. It's creating a complex emotional conflict about justice, forgiveness, and the circumstances that could drive good people to make terrible decisions. As the testimony continued, Judge Harrison prepared to reveal information that would fundamentally change how everyone in the courtroom understood Michael Torres's case in the complex web of military service, sacrifice, and family legacy that had brought them all together in pursuit of justice. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, requesting that all attorneys meet with him in his chambers immediately. The unusual request created a buzz of speculation among the reporters and spectators, who sensed that something significant was developing beyond the standard criminal proceedings they had expected to witness in the privacy of his chambers. Judge Harrison faced a decision that would test every principle of judicial ethics and personal integrity he had developed during his 30 years on the bench. He looked at both attorneys, understanding that what he was about to reveal could fundamentally change the trajectory of the case and possibly create grounds for appeal if not handled properly. Counselors, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of years of careful legal consideration. I need to share information that may be relevant to this case. 25 years ago, during my military service in the Gulf War, my life was saved by a soldier named Roberto Torres. I have recently confirmed that Roberto Torres was the defendant's father. The revelation stunned both attorneys. Jennifer Walsh immediately recognized the potential impact of this connection. While District Attorney Chen began calculating whether the judge's personal involvement created grounds for demanding his recusal from the case, Your Honor, Chen said carefully, this information raises serious questions about judicial impartiality. The defendant's family connection to your personal military experience could be seen as creating bias in his favor. Judge Harrison had anticipated this objection and had spent considerable time researching the legal precedents and ethical guidelines that applied to his situation. Ms. Chen, I have thoroughly reviewed the relevant case law and ethical standards. My connection to the Torres family predates this case by decades and does not create a financial or personal interest that would require recusal. However, I believe this information provides important context that should be shared with the jury. Jennifer Walsh felt a surge of hope. Recognizing that the judge's connection to Michael's family could provide the emotional context that might inspire mercy from the jury. Your Honor, I believe this information demonstrates the multi-generational sacrifice that military families make in service to our country. It's directly relevant to understanding my client's character and background. The judge's decision to reveal his connection to the Torres family represented a significant departure from typical judicial protocol. Most judges would have either recused themselves from the case or kept such personal connections private. Harrison's choice to address the issue openly demonstrated his commitment to transparency while also providing crucial context about the defendant's family legacy of military service. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison addressed the jury directly about his connection to the case. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed, I need to share information that may influence your understanding of this case. 25 years ago, the defendant's father saved my life during military combat in the Gulf War, Sergeant First Class. Roberto Torres died from complications related to injuries he sustained during that heroic action. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as people processed this unexpected revelation. Michael Torres looked up sharply, his expression showing shock and confusion about the judge's connection to his father. Sarah Torres gasped audibly from the gallery, recognizing immediately how this information might affect her husband's case. "I've decided not to recuse myself from this case," Judge Harrison continued, "because I believe my understanding of the Torres family's military sacrifice provides important context rather than creating bias. However, I want all parties to understand this background as we proceed toward resolution." District Attorney Chen requested an immediate sidebar conference, arguing that the judge's revelation created irreversible prejudice that would make any conviction subject to appeal. "Your Honor, you have essentially told the jury that you owe a personal debt to the defendant's family. No jury can remain impartial after hearing such information." Judge Harrison considered the prosecutor's argument carefully. "Ms. Chen, I understand your concern, but I believe concealing relevant information about the defendant's family history would be a greater disservice to justice than revealing it. The jury needs to understand the full context of military service and sacrifice that has shaped this family's experience." Michael Torres struggled to process the information that the judge presiding over his case had been saved by his father. Decades earlier, Roberto Torres had rarely spoken about his military service in detail, preferring to focus on his family and civilian career after returning from combat. Michael had known his father was a war veteran, but had never learned the specific details of his battlefield heroism. "Your Honor," Michael said, rising slowly to address the court, "may I ask what you remember about my father?" The question created another unprecedented moment in the trial proceedings. Defendants rarely addressed judges directly during criminal trials, and personal conversations between judges and defendants were highly unusual. However, Judge Harrison recognized the significance of the moment and the importance of honoring Roberto Torres's memory. "Master Sergeant Torres," Judge Harrison replied, using Michael's military rank rather than referring to him as a defendant, "your father was one of the bravest men I ever served with. He spotted enemy infiltrators approaching our position and single-handedly held them off until reinforcements arrived. His actions saved not just my life, but the lives of 37 other American soldiers." The description of Roberto Torres's heroism created a profound silence in the courtroom. Everyone present was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more complex than a standard criminal trial. 3 generations of military service, sacrifice, and heroism were intersecting in ways that challenged conventional approaches to criminal justice. Roberto Sanchez, the robbery victim, listened to the judge's description of the elder Torres's heroism with growing emotional conflict. He was beginning to understand that the man who had terrified him during the robbery came from a family with a long history of protecting others, even at great personal cost. The knowledge didn't excuse Michael's actions, but it provided context. That made the situation far more complicated than a simple case of criminal behavior. Jennifer Walsh recognized that the trial had evolved beyond standard legal proceedings into something approaching a moral and ethical examination of justice, service, and redemption. The judge's revelation about his connection to the Torres family had created an opportunity to address broader questions about how society should respond when war heroes face civilian struggles that lead to criminal behavior. General Morrison, who had followed news of Michael's arrest with great concern, sat in the back of the courtroom observing the unprecedented proceedings. As the officer who had recommended Michael for the Medal of Honor, the general felt a personal responsibility for understanding how such a decorated soldier had ended up facing criminal charges. The Medal of Honor itself seemed to take on greater significance as the trial proceedings continued. What had begun as a piece of evidence documenting Michael's past achievements was becoming a symbol of the complex relationship between military heroism and civilian justice, forcing everyone present to grapple with difficult questions about honor, sacrifice, and the price of service to one's country. The third day of trial brought an unexpected witness that would change everything. Judge Harrison had made an unusual decision overnight, using his judicial authority to subpoena military records and request the presence of Colonel James Patterson, who had served as Roberto Torres's commanding officer during the Gulf War. The colonel, now retired but still carrying himself with military bearing, entered the courtroom with documents that would provide crucial details about the TPL's family's military legacy. Colonel Patterson took the witness stand with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of the testimony he was about to provide. His presence had been requested to establish the complete record of Roberto Torres's service and sacrifice. Information that Judge Harrison believed was essential for the jury to understand the full context of Michael's situation. Colonel Patterson, Judge Harrison began. Please describe Sergeant First Class Roberto Torres's actions during the incident that occurred on March 15, 1999. The colonel consulted his notes, though his memory of that night remained vivid even after 25 years. Your Honor, Sergeant Torres was on perimeter guard duty when he detected enemy infiltrators attempting to breach our defensive position. Rather than simply sounding an alarm, he engaged the enemy single-handedly to prevent them from reaching the main compound where 37 soldiers were sleeping. The testimony provided details that Judge Harrison had never fully known about his own rescue. As a young lieutenant at the time, he'd been awakened by gunfire and had participated in the response to the attack, but he had never learned the complete story of how Roberto Torres had prevented what could have been a massacre. Sergeant Torres sustained multiple gunshot wounds during his engagement with the enemy, Colonel Patterson continued. Despite his injuries, he maintained his position until reinforcements arrived and the threat was neutralized. Medical personnel later determined that his actions had prevented enemy forces from accessing explosives stored near the sleeping quarters. Michael Torres listened to this account of his father's heroism with tears in his eyes, learning details about Roberto's service that had never been shared with the family. His father had always been modest about his military experience, preferring to focus on peacetime family life rather than dwelling on combat memories. The colonel's testimony revealed that Roberto Torres had been recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions that night, but had died from his combat-related injuries before the award process could be completed. Military bureaucracy and changing priorities had allowed his heroic actions to be recognized only with lesser decorations, a common injustice that affected many deserving veterans. Colonel Judge Harrison asked, his voice carefully controlled, "In your professional opinion, how did Sergeant Torres's sacrifice affect the soldiers whose lives he saved that night?" Colonel Patterson looked directly at the judge as he responded, "Your Honor, 37 soldiers went home to their families because of Roberto Torres's courage and sacrifice. Many of those soldiers went on to distinguished military and civilian careers, contributing to their communities and raising families of their own. The ripple effects of his heroism continued to this day." The testimony was creating an emotional atmosphere in the courtroom that transcended typical criminal proceedings. Jury members were beginning to understand that Michael Torres's case was part of a larger story about military sacrifice and the ongoing impact of combat service on multiple generations of American families. Roberto Sanchez, the robbery victim, found himself deeply affected by learning about the Torres family's military history. The knowledge that Michael's father had died from combat injuries sustained, while saving other soldiers, provided painful context about the legacy of service and sacrifice that had shaped Michael's life and values. District Attorney Chen recognized that the testimony was significantly complicating her case by generating sympathy for the defendant's family background. However, she also understood that opposing testimony about military heroism could damage her own credibility with a jury that was clearly moved by the Torres family's story. General Morrison stepped forward from the gallery, requesting permission to address the court. His presence as the officer who had recommended Michael for the Medal of Honor added another layer of military authority to the proceedings. Judge Harrison granted permission for the general to speak, recognizing that his testimony could provide important insights into Michael's character and military service. "Your Honor," General Morrison said, "I had the privilege of serving with both Roberto Torres and his son Michael during their respective military careers. The courage and selflessness that Roberto demonstrated in saving your life was passed down to his son, who displayed identical valor in Afghanistan when he saved 3 soldiers under remarkably similar circumstances." The general's testimony established a direct parallel between father and son, both of whom had risked everything to save fellow soldiers. The comparison made Michael's current circumstances even more tragic, highlighting how a decorated war hero following his father's example of sacrifice had ended up facing criminal charges for actions motivated by desperation to help his own family. Judge Harrison spent the evening after testimony reviewing legal precedents, military regulations, and victim impact statements, searching for a resolution that would honor all the competing interests represented in Michael Torres's case. The judge's chambers were filled with law books, military histories, and psychological studies about veteran transition challenges as he prepared for what would be one of the most difficult decisions of his judicial career. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would further complicate the case. Emma Torres, Michael's 8-year-old daughter, had asked her mother to bring her to court so she could tell the important people why Daddy needed to help me. Sarah had initially refused, believing the courtroom was no place for a child, but Emma's persistence and her obvious desire to help her father had eventually convinced her mother to allow the visit. Judge Harrison was informed of Emma's presence and made the unusual decision to speak with her privately in his chambers, with both attorneys present to ensure proper legal oversight. The judge understood that a child's testimony could provide crucial insights into Michael's motivation, while also demonstrating the human impact of the case's resolution. Emma entered the judge's chambers wearing her best dress, walking carefully. Due to the leg braces she still needed following her recent surgery, her presence immediately transformed the formal legal atmosphere into something more personal and emotionally charged. Judge Harrison adjusted his approach, speaking to Emma with the gentle authority he might use with his own grandchildren. "Emma," Judge Harrison said softly, "I understand you wanted to talk to us about your daddy. Can you tell me what you think is important for us to know?" Emma's voice was clear and confident despite the intimidating surroundings. "Daddy has always taken care of me and Mommy. When I was sick and the doctor said I needed surgery, Daddy was very worried because we didn't have enough money. He told Mommy he would find a way to help me get better, no matter what." The child's innocent explanation of her father's desperation provided a heartbreaking perspective on the circumstances that had led to the robbery. Emma clearly didn't understand the criminal implications of her father's actions. Seeing only a parent who had tried to help her when she needed medical treatment, Jennifer Walsh asked Emma about her father's character and behavior at home, hoping to establish evidence of Michael's fundamental decency despite his criminal actions. "Emma, how does your daddy treat you and your mommy when you're all at home together?" "Daddy is the best father in the world," Emma replied without hesitation. "He reads me stories every night, helps me with homework, and teaches me about being brave when things are scary. He always says that helping people is the most important thing we can do." The irony of Emma's description was not lost on anyone present. Michael had taught his daughter about helping others and being brave, values that had driven his military heroism but had also contributed to his desperate decision to rob the convenience store when faced with her medical needs. Judge Harrison felt deeply moved by Emma's testimony, recognizing the additional tragedy that Michael's incarceration would separate a devoted father, a daughter who clearly adored him. The case was becoming more complex with each piece of evidence. challenging simple notions of criminal justice and appropriate punishment. District Attorney Chen struggled with the emotional impact of Emma's presence, understanding that prosecuting a case involving such a young child's medical needs and her obvious love for her father would be difficult for any jury to handle dispassionately. However, she also recognized her responsibility to uphold the law regardless of sympathetic circumstances. When court resumed with the full jury present, Judge Harrison made another unprecedented decision. He asked Emma to sit in the witness chair, not to testify formally, but to allow the jury to see the child, whose medical needs had motivated her father's desperate actions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Harrison addressed them directly. This is Emma Torres, Master Sergeant Torres's daughter. The medical expenses related to her surgery were the immediate cause of her father's financial desperation. I want you to see the child he was trying to help when he made his terrible decision. Emma waved shyly at the jury members, several of whom were visibly affected by seeing the actual child whose medical needs had driven the case. Her leg braces were clearly visible, providing tangible evidence of the serious medical condition that had created the family's financial crisis. Michael Torres struggled to maintain his composure as he watched his daughter interact with the jury and court officials. The sight of Emma in the formal courtroom setting, surrounded by the legal proceedings that would determine his fate, filled him with overwhelming guilt about the consequences his actions had created for his family. Roberto Sanchez observed Emma with complex emotions, seeing for the first time the innocent child whose medical needs had motivated the crime against him. While he couldn't excuse Michael's actions, he found it impossible to remain completely unsympathetic toward a father who had acted out of desperation to help his sick daughter. Judge Harrison then made a request that stunned everyone in the courtroom. Master Sergeant Torres, I want you to hold your Medal of Honor while I ask you some questions about the night you committed the robbery. The request seemed bizarre to legal observers who couldn't understand why a judge would want a defendant to hold his military decoration while discussing his criminal actions. However, Judge Harrison had a specific purpose in mind that would soon become clear to everyone present. Michael accepted his Medal of Honor from the court clerk, the weight of the decoration feeling heavier than usual as he held it while standing in a criminal courtroom. The contrast between the medal's representation of his highest achievements and his current status as a criminal defendant was almost unbearable. Master Sergeant Torres, Judge Harrison said, you earned this medal by risking your life to save your fellow soldiers. On the night you robbed Mr. Sanchez's store, were you thinking about your military values and the oath you took to protect innocent people? The question forced Michael to confront the moral complexity of his actions while holding the physical symbol of his military heroism. Your Honor, I was thinking only about my daughter's medical needs and my failure to provide for my family through legitimate means. I wasn't thinking about military values or protecting innocent people. I was focused entirely on getting money for Emma's surgery. Judge Harrison's next question would reveal the full purpose of this unusual examination. Master Sergeant Torres, if you could go back to that night and make a different choice, what would you do? Michael's response would demonstrate whether he had learned from his experience and whether he deserved consideration for rehabilitation rather than purely punitive justice. His answer, while holding his Medal of Honor, would symbolize either his commitment to redemption or his fundamental inability to reconcile his military values with civilian challenges. The courtroom waited in tense silence for Michael's response, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would determine not just his legal fate, but also his personal path toward either redemption or continued failure. The Medal of Honor in his hands seemed to pulse with the weight of expectations and the memory of heroism that had once defined his character. Emma Torres watched her father from the gallery, not fully understanding the legal proceedings but sensing that something very important was happening that would affect their family's future. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the innocent life that had motivated both Michael's past heroism and his recent criminal behavior. Judge Harrison prepared to hear Michael's answer while considering the unprecedented ruling he was planning to announce. The case had evolved far beyond standard criminal justice into a complex examination of honor, sacrifice, redemption, and the ongoing obligations society had toward veterans who had given so much in service to their country. Michael Torres looked down at the Medal of Honor in his hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented: the lives he had saved, the values he had sworn to uphold, and the trust that had been placed in him by his fellow soldiers and his nation. When he looked up to answer Judge Harrison's question, tears were streaming down his face. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice breaking with emotion, "if I could go back to that night, I would have swallowed my pride and asked for help. I would have reached out to veteran organizations, military charities, or even started a public fundraising campaign for Emma's surgery. There were other options available, but I was too proud and too ashamed to admit that a Medal of Honor recipient couldn't take care of his own family." The honesty and vulnerability in Michael's response affected everyone in the courtroom. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing that Michael's answer demonstrated genuine understanding of his mistakes and commitment to making better choices in the future. "Master Sergeant Torres," Judge Harrison continued, "you have acknowledged your crime, expressed genuine remorse, and demonstrated that you understand there were legal alternatives to the choice you made. Now, I want to address the broader context that has emerged during these proceedings." The judge stood and walked to where Michael was holding his medal, creating a dramatic visual that photographers would capture and newspapers would feature on their front pages the following day. "This Medal of Honor represents not just your individual heroism, but your family's multi-generational commitment to serving and protecting others. Your father died from injuries sustained while saving my life and the lives of 36 other soldiers." Judge Harrison's voice carried increasing emotion as he continued. "The tragic irony of this case is that a family known for protecting innocent people found themselves in circumstances where desperation led to actions that threatened an innocent person.
Ow.
This represents a failure not just of individual judgment, but of our society's commitment to caring for those who have sacrificed for our protection." Roberto Sanchez stood up from the gallery, requesting permission to address the court one final time. "Your Honor, I've been thinking about everything I've heard during this trial. Master Sergeant Torres robbed me because he was trying to save his daughter's life after sacrificing his own health serving our country. I can't excuse what he did to me, but I also can't ignore the circumstances that drove him to such desperation." The store clerk's words carried special weight because they came from the person who had been most directly harmed by Michael's actions. His willingness to acknowledge the complex circumstances surrounding the crime demonstrated the kind of understanding and compassion that could make restorative justice possible. "Mr. Sanchez," Judge Harrison asked, "are you willing to participate in a resolution that focuses on rehabilitation and restitution rather than purely punitive measures?" Sanchez looked at Michael Torres, seeing not just the man who had robbed him, but also a father who had been driven to desperation by circumstances beyond his control. "Yes, Your Honor, I believe Master Sergeant Torres can become the person his military service suggests he really is, but he needs help and support, not just punishment." Judge Harrison then announced a sentence that would be discussed in legal circles for years to come, instead of the standard prison term that Michael's crimes would normally warrant. The judge imposed a sentence that combined accountability with rehabilitation, punishment with opportunity for redemption. "Master Sergeant Torres," Judge Harrison said, "you are sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, during which you will complete 2,000 hours of community service working with veteran organizations to help other struggling veterans avoid the mistakes you made. You will also make full restitution to Mr. Sanchez and attend counseling to address the issues that led to your criminal behavior." The sentence was unprecedented in its creativity and its focus on using Michael's experience to help others, rather than simply removing him from society through incarceration. Judge Harrison was requiring him to transform his failure into a resource for preventing similar tragedies in other veteran families. Additionally, the judge continued, "I am recommending that your case serve as the foundation for developing enhanced support programs for veterans facing financial crises related to family medical needs. Your crime should not be repeated because society failed to provide adequate safety nets for families who have already sacrificed so much in military service." Michael Torres felt overwhelmed by the unexpected opportunity for redemption rather than punishment. The sentence would allow him to remain with his family while working to repair the damage his actions had caused, both to Roberto Sanchez and to his own sense of honor and integrity, Emma Torres clapped excitedly from the gallery. Not fully understanding the legal details, but recognizing that her father would be coming home rather than going to prison. Sarah Torres wept with relief, grateful that their family would have a chance to heal and rebuild together. Judge Harrison concluded the proceedings by addressing the broader significance of the case. This trial has demonstrated that justice is not just about punishment, but about understanding the complex circumstances that lead good people to make terrible decisions. Master Sergeant Torres's crime was inexcusable, but the circumstances that drove it reveal failures in our support systems that must be addressed. 1 year later, Michael Torres had completed over half of his community service hours, working with veteran organizations to develop emergency financial assistance programs for military families facing medical crises. His work had helped establish funding sources that prevented other desperate veterans from facing the same impossible choices that had led to his criminal behavior. Roberto Sanchez had become an advocate for veteran support programs, using his experience as a crime victim to highlight the need for better civilian transition services for combat veterans. His partnership with Michael in developing community awareness about veteran issues had created an unexpected friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing similar tragedies. Emma Torres recovered completely from her surgery and often accompanied her father to his community service work, learning about the importance of helping others and the possibility of redemption after making serious mistakes. Her presence at veteran events served as a powerful reminder of why supporting military families was so important. Judge D. Harrison's handling of the case had created a new model for addressing cases involving veterans whose criminal behavior stemmed from service-related challenges. Legal scholars studied his approach as an example of therapeutic jurisprudence that sought healing and prevention rather than purely punitive outcomes. The Medal of Honor, that had once seemed like evidence of Michael's fall from grace, had instead become a symbol of the possibility for redemption and the ongoing responsibility that heroes had to serve their communities, even after making serious mistakes. The medal that had shaken the courtroom with its contrast to criminal charges had ultimately helped create a path toward healing that honored both justice and mercy. Michael Torres never again forgot the lesson he had learned while holding his Medal of Honor in that courtroom. True heroism wasn't just about moments of extraordinary courage in combat, but about the daily choice to live according to the values that the medal represented. Even when facing the most difficult challenges civilian life could present, the judge's wisdom in recognizing this truth had saved not just one family, but had created a foundation for helping countless other veteran families avoid similar tragedies in the future.